across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time talking about a number of different issues. Matter of fact, in the second hour, we'll get into a couple of issues that are really beginning to affect the Trump administration. One report is that Donald Trump may be eyeing Rudy Giuliani as the Attorney General to replace Jeff Sessions if indeed he steps down or is asked to leave. We have, of course, Congress heading towards its August recess. So far, have we gotten health care reform? No, I don't think so. Tax reform? No. Package for infrastructure? No. How about a budget? Not quite yet. How about government funding? And, of course, we'll get into those topics. Last Friday, we spent some time briefly talking about the working poor. So we're going to get into some of that in the second hour as well, give you an update on the health care bill, and also what is happening right now with the Election Integrity Panel. All that pretty much for the second hour. But in this first hour, I wanted to focus on a topic we sometimes mention but never really get into, and that is the Southern Poverty Law Center. You've heard some commentaries that I've done in which I've talked about what they do in terms of labeling very legitimate Christian organizations as hate groups, the impact that that has had, then the decision by at least one particular charity navigator saying that they would even list those groups as hate groups. So we're going to get into this in some detail because there is this video, which we have information about on our website, that I think you're going to want to see, Prophets of Hate, the Southern Poverty Law Center. And to educate us on this issue, we go to our good friend, Dr. Frank Wright. For many years, of course, we knew him as the president of the National Religious Broadcasters. Before that, of course, he served as the Center for Christian Statesmanship and is currently now the president of D. James Kennedy Ministries, has his Ph.D. from Florida Atlantic University, and joins us now by phone. Frank, it's always great to have you on the program with us. Well, I guess we don't have Frank, so we'll do our best to get to Frank Wright in just a minute. Frank, here we go. Frank, are you there now?
I am. Kerby, good to hear your voice. Thanks for having me on today.
Very good. Okay, we have to get into this whole issue of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, at the outset, let's talk about an organization that did, at the waning days of the civil rights movement, have a legitimate function. It's long since left that, but there was a time in which they were accurately and responsibly identifying various hate groups and educating us about some of those individuals that were anti-Semitic, anti-black, or whatever they might be. And so at least their history is one that in the past was at least somewhat admirable, wasn't it?
I think that's fair to say. I think it's also fair to say that the SPLC is a classic example of a good idea gone bad. They started on the right foot. They did a great work in testing some of the new civil rights laws that were adopted in the 1960s and forced states and other entities who were somewhat reluctant to go along with, civil rights for all Americans, and they fought those cases in the court. They literally put some of the last vestiges of the Ku Klux Klan. They were just a struggling organization even into the late and middle 70s. And the Southern Poverty Law Center was effective in putting some of them out of business, bankrupting them by hauling them into court and getting judgments against them. And their source of funding, though, seems to have been the reason why they went from good to bad. They were, in the early days, funded by basically a direct mail operation targeted at Northeastern liberal Americans, people who have little understanding or knowledge of the South in general, but clearly having compassion and passion about civil rights. And so the Southern Poverty Law Center raised a ton of money through its direct mail process. And as they achieved success in the civil rights arena, that all began to dry up. Many of their donors began to perceive that, hey, the Ku Klux Klan is just a handful of people left. It's not a real threat. We've won these major victories. And it was about that time that the Southern Poverty Law Center turned its sights on a whole new group of people that they, as you've already referenced, people that they labeled haters. And the definition that they use for hate is wildly inconsistent, not to mention how difficult it is to look into someone's heart and decide whether the actions you see are motivated by hate. But they have thrown Bible-believing Christians and even many conservatives into the same group with the Klan, the neo-Nazis, the skinheads, calling all of us haters. And the implications here are enormous. They go beyond just the operations of one group that has accumulated $300 million of cash in offshore bank accounts as a result of its successful direct mail efforts. But these implications go far beyond just the SPLC and literally threaten the religious freedom of all Americans.
And again, if you look at their hate maps, and again, if you watch the video, and we have a link there, and we'll talk more about where people can get a copy of that and how they can help promote and educate others, you will see some groups that definitely deserve that designation. But
That's
mixed
right.
in with that are groups like, let me name at least a few names, the Family Research Council, the American Family Association, and of course, D. James Kennedy's Ministries, Truth to Transform, those kinds of things. Also, it isn't necessarily Christians that get targeted. I've seen like the American College of Pediatricians gets into that list, the American Freedom Defense Initiative. We're talking about a hodgepodge of organizations and groups, most of which any fair-minded individual would say do not belong on that list with all of those groups that really do have some kind of hateful animus towards different groups or different individuals.
I think that's right, and I think if you line up all those groups and look at them with a critical eye, what you're really seeing is that the SPLC shift was away from its emphasis on the Klan and the neo-Nazis and the skinheads, but not just towards people that disagree with them on civil rights, but people that disagree with their leftist agenda on anything. You defend preborn babies, you're a hater. You support traditional marriage, you're a hater. How about immigration enforcement? You guessed it, border security. Anything literally that departs from the hard left progressive liberal agenda gets you branded a hater. And of course their first goal here is really just to silence the speech of others. The courts have spoken down through the previous decades about the chilling effect on speech that some activities can have, and that all speech is protected. Well, that's not really true. Not all speech, the pornography and defamation. There's certain speeches that are not protected by the First Amendment, but in general, the courts have defended even unpopular speech and struck down actions that have a chilling effect on speech and freedom. That's exactly what the SPLC is trying to do, create a chilling effect, label you something that's so inconsistent with who you are. Kerby, you and I both know a lot of the people in those organizations you mentioned.
Yes.
The American Family Association and Don and Tim Wildman and Tony Perkins at the Family Research Council. And these are not haters. These are people who operate in the field of public policy out of their deep Christian conviction and concern for other people. So this is a rhetorical device, and it's one that the left uses successfully.
We're going to take a break and come back and talk about the implications of all of this. There are quite a number. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Frank Wright right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
David Brooks took on the difficult task of reminding us that class distinctions in America do make a difference. For that, he was pilloried in the social media. He was trying to explain how the privileged elite are ruining America. He unfortunately came off to some as an example of another privileged elite. He may have fared better if he had not mentioned taking a friend with only a high school degree to a sandwich shop that had sandwiches with nearly unpronounceable Italian names. If we ignore that paragraph, he really had some important observations. For example, he showed how upper middle-class moms and parents confer on their children certain benefits often unavailable to others. Put simply, they spend more time with their kids. He also focused on how the privileged also are able to exclude other people's children from their same opportunities. Richard Reeves writes about this in his book, Dream Hoarders. Zoning restrictions are one way. Well-educated people tend to live in places like Portland, New York, and San Francisco. I talked about this in a recent commentary about bubbles. Many of the people in blue states and liberal cities are socially isolated from the rest of society. Many of these zoning restrictions also serve to keep the poor and the less educated away from places with good schools and good job opportunities. Another structural barrier is college admissions. Educated parents live in neighborhoods with the best schools and the best teachers. This gives an obvious advantage to students who want to go to college of their choice. David Brooks does not mention other advantages that occur to me. Students with affluent parents may not need to get a summer job so they can do internships or volunteer work that looks good on resumes. They can also afford to take test prep courses in order to do well on SAT tests. David Brooks identifies a real concern, but unfortunately too many decided to lampoon his attempt to explain why it is a problem. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged today to talk with Dr. Frank Wright, and again, he is with the James Kennedy Ministries, and also as an individual that served for many years as the president and CEO of the National Religious Broadcasters. And I might just mention, Frank, that 2 weeks ago, matter of fact, we just played my commentary for those that happen to be listening online. I did a commentary on what I called the Guide Star Wars, because one of the places where a lot of our listeners oftentimes go to check out a particular charity or nonprofit organization is Guide Star, and it's supposed to be kind of a neutral aggregator of tax data on various charities. But they decided, based on what the Southern Poverty Law Center has been doing, designating groups like your group and many other Christian groups, to actually list them as hate groups on the Guide Star website. So this moves beyond just, okay, we'll label these groups as hate groups, so we'll silence them. This is, I think, moving into an arena, which was done primarily by Jacob Harold at Guide Star, to also defund some of those groups as well. Now, since then, they've decided to remove that label, at least for the moment. But talk about that, because that's been a new development that's just come about just a few weeks ago.
Well, Kerby, you put your finger on the real issue of concern with the Southern Poverty Law Center. You and I could have a long discussion about how wrong they are to label us as hate groups and how misguided that is. But the real issue with them, the first kind of the prima facie problem that we face is other people are taking them seriously. For a long time, the FBI was using the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map to help them identify groups that they need to keep an eye on. The FBI has announced recently that they're not doing that any longer. But I remember being with Tony Perkins at an event one time, and he handed me a fax machine printout with his face on it. And he said, this was sent to me by a sheriff from Louisiana, and he said, it says that I am the leader of a hate organization. And so a law enforcement entity in the state of Louisiana, Tony's home state, looked at the Southern Poverty Law Center hate map, found the Family Research Council, and decided this guy is the leader of a hate group, and went so far as to send out what Barney Fife would call an all-points bulletin with Tony's picture on it, depicting him as a hater. And so when we see GuideStar using that hate map to make decisions about the ranking that it's going to give, reputable public charities, we're seeing another vestige of this effect that they have. They still are looked at by many people in the liberal, particularly the liberal side of the political spectrum, but even others who just don't know any better, as a source of information on hate groups. And as you said at the outset, Kerby, they have covered well the Klan and the neo-Nazis and the skinheads and these others. They do have legitimate hate groups on their hate map. But these days, it's anything that causes any diversion from their liberal and leftist agenda will get you labeled a hater for the purpose of silencing you. And as you just said very well, the GuideStar issue leads to the prospect of seeing valid Christian organizations become defunded because of not only misleading but clearly false information on their website.
Now, one of the things in your video, I think this is the piece that John Ray puts in there, and also, of course, Jerry Newcomb, but there's one piece there where it shows an interview with Bob Schieffer, who is, in introducing Tony Perkins, introduces him as the leader of a hate group and said there were all sorts of individuals that were arguing against even allowing him to be on the air. So once again, you see that this label not only can silence you, not only defund you, but even prevent certain broadcast entities from allowing you to even have a place at the table for an open discussion.
I think that's right. I think that also points to the other issue is you and I covered when I was at the National Religious Broadcasters. We talked about the forthcoming hate crimes legislation that was, in fact, ultimately adopted by the Congress. It did not cover in its language. It did not cover speech, but in all 50 states, or I shouldn't say all 50, but in all the states that have any kind of a hate crime statute, which all preceded the federal statute, all of those things eventually bled over into the area of speech. So by labeling a group of people speech and haters, and then you have Howard Dean step up and say, hey, the First Amendment doesn't cover hate speech. You begin, and then you have GuideStar with the defunding, and you have Tony Perkins not being treated as a legitimate candidate to be interviewed by the national news media. And what you're seeing literally, in my view, is, and people are going to say this is hyperbolic, but they probably said it in the late 1930s and early 1940s as well. You're seeing the beginning of those that control the access to communication power. That's the mainstream media for the most part. Thankfully, we have other accesses to different media sources these days we didn't have 20, 25 years ago. They're trying to herd us all into a stained glass ghetto. We can go to our churches and sit in our stained glass buildings, and we can talk to each other about anything we want. You take it out into the public square, that's a horse of a different color, and it may be one that will not only jeopardize your freedom of speech, but even your freedom, period. So it sounds hyperbolic to some, but if you dig deep enough, what you're seeing here are the early vestiges, the kind of the leading edge of an effort to marginalize Christian thought, Christian speech, and not make it acceptable in the public square.
Talking with Dr. Frank Wright, and we have a link to djameskennedy.org. But before we take a break, let's see if we also can talk about the dangers of this. And the best example, and again, you have this on your video, Prophets of Hate, is you actually show the video, which I'd never seen before until I saw your video. I've always heard about it, read about it, of Floyd Corkins coming into the Family Research Council, reaching down, pulling out a gun, and if it weren't for the guard taking a shot in the arm and eventually wrestling him down, his goal was to go and kill as many people as possible at the Family Research Council, smear a Chick-fil-A sandwich in their face as they were dying, and it's all because, as he acknowledges, again, in the video that you show, that he got this idea from the Southern Poverty Law Center.
In the legal world, they call that incitement to violence, and the Southern Poverty Law Center won't own up to it, but Floyd Corkins said Floyd Corkins admitted he was a homosexual, he was a a radical and angry man, and he went in there to, not only was he going to stuff Chick-fil-A sandwiches in their face, he was going to stuff it down their throat and photograph their dead bodies and try to use that as a way to scare other people. And you're right, the security guard who stopped him was a hero of the First Order. So we see this motivation when you label people haters, and you see the national news media accept that definition, and even legitimate folks like GuideStar and others, you're seeing a defining downward and of what is acceptable speech, and it's the kind of speech that's always been protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment has 5 parts to it, and the first part is the free exercise of religion. And we've got, again, Howard Dean saying hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. If they make this idea stick from a cultural standpoint, it's not an overreach to say your religious worship will not be protected by the First Amendment because it's characterized as haters. Your ministry that tries to seek to send missionaries around the world to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. No. You're exporting hate, you see. You lose your tax-exempt status. You lose your funding. This hate is so much, this idea of labeling everything hate is so much bigger than just the Southern Poverty Law Center, but they are the prophet, the Moses of that movement, trying to use it against anybody that disagrees with liberalism.
Dr. Frank Wright with us, and let's take a break. When we come back, though, I want to open up the phones. I suspect by now you have some comments or questions. That number is 1-800-351-1212. We have a link, of course, to D. James Kennedy's ministry, or, of course, Frank Wright's ministry. We also have information about that video. Matter of fact, the video is about 28 and a half minutes long. It's something that I would encourage you to watch, and then you might even hit the share button and put it on your Facebook page or have a link to it in one way or another so that others would learn about this. And so we'll talk more about how you can kind of advance this educational process that has been developed through the D. James Kennedy Ministry right now. But if you'd like to join the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. And as you go to the website, you'll find more information about Dr. Frank Wright, about D. James Kennedy Ministries. But I hope you'll also click on that button that says donate. Perhaps you're learning for the first time about some of this. And if you appreciate the education we provide, we would certainly appreciate your financial support. Let's take a break, though. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take those calls right after this.
In an age of fake news, getting good information is vital. Point of View works to bring you that each and every day. But as Diane in Arkansas illustrates, passing that information along, educating others, is something you can help with. Diane is a college professor. She influences the next generation, and she wrote, "Thank you for your informative letter. I used some of your quotes when I was teaching the Declaration of Independence in my literature class." Diane, like so many, hopefully like you, is taking what she received from Point of View in letters, online, through our app, on the air, and rebuilding truth in this post-truth culture. All of that takes a team. Join the Truth Team at Point of View. Find out how you can help at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. Show your commitment. Make a difference today, right now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continuing our conversation today with Dr. Frank Wright, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Frank, before we get back into this, let's talk about what is available at your website. It is djameskennedy.org. People don't even have to know how to spell it all because we've got a natural link that they can follow there. And, of course, one of those issues we're talking about today is what are called the Kennedy Classics. And this video, 28 and a half minutes long, called The Prophets of Hate. It's available on your website, and as people go there and watch it, how can they help promote this? Because there are just a lot of individuals that need to know about this and need to get some clarification and have some discernment when they see these labels being thrown around about various groups being hate groups.
You know, Kerby, I remember when Dr. Kennedy and Marlon Maddox and many others, including yourself, no doubt, began to expose the ACLU for what it really was back in the late 70s, early 1980s. They were widely seen as an organization in favor of civil liberties for all Americans. And in fact, some will remember the day when they defended the neo-Nazis who went into Skokie, Illinois, a very heavily Jewish neighborhood, and tried to host a parade or some kind of an event there. And it was the ACLU that went and defended the Nazis because they defended unpopular speech. But they, too, began to morph into an organization that defends only certain kinds of speech. Free speech for their friends, free speech for ideas with which they agree. And now here we are in this day where the Southern Poverty Law Center I see as the latter-day ACLU. We have got to expose to Americans what this group really is. And so the way that people can help us do that is by going to our website. And actually there's a shortcut version to our website's domain name as well. It's djkm.org. And if you go to djkm.org/SPLC, you go right to a media player where you can play this special. And then you can find out how, as you've already suggested, how through social media and email and other means that you can make links available to your friends and those in your circle of influence, because this group, if not stopped, is going to literally wreak havoc with the First Amendment, havoc with religious free speech and free exercise. And that's what we're trying to do today, is take the mask off of these folks, a group that raises $50 million a year, supposedly to fight poverty, which they do none of, supposedly to engage in legal action in defense of civil liberty. They do very little of that now in these latter days. They have $300 million sitting in offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, and everybody should be asking questions about this nefarious organization.
Very good. So again, djkm.org. Of course, we have a link there as well, so you can write it out or use those initials. And before we get back to the Prophets of Hate, one of the things I love to do when I have somebody that's really good at cultural analysis, when we used to have Chuck Colson on, or even more recently we've had John Stonestreet or Eric Metaxas, you fit into this category. Talk about this for just a minute, because we're seeing what seems like a contradiction to a lot of our listeners. Let's face it, you have Republicans in control of the House, Republicans in control of the Senate, a Republican that's in the Oval Office. All those individuals that are in leadership have a very high view of religious liberty. And yet we see all sorts of places where religious liberty is being challenged, sometimes in the courts, but oftentimes in the culture. And so I think it's maybe helpful to recognize that oftentimes politics is downstream of culture, and groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, GuideStar, also, you mentioned, of course, the ACLU. We can go through a very long list of organizations that are really challenging the freedom of Christians. So do you see some kind of discontinuity there? Because in one sense, you'd say the individuals that have control of the levers of government, they have a very high view of religious liberty, yet it seems like every day I'm talking with Kelly Shackelford or Jay Sekulow or somebody who's actually having to defend religious liberty in the courts and in our culture.
Well, I do agree with and it's kind of you to put me in the category with these other guys. I'm not so sure that I warrant that kind of treatment, but you're very gracious. But I have looked at these things a long time, and I hearken back to a Supreme Court decision which was used by the court in 1947 to begin to chip away at religious free exercise. It's the so-called Everson decision. And Kerby, you'll remember that in that decision, the court used a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists in which he said that the Constitution had erected a great wall of separation between church and state, and that the Baptist Church, therefore, had no reason to worry about the federal government intruding itself into their affairs. Interestingly, in that very same letter, Jefferson prefaces his remarks about the wall by saying, "Our laws touch on actions only, not on ideas!" Exclamation point. That the exclamation point is mine, but that's what Jefferson said.
Yes.
Our laws touch on actions, not on ideas. You know, I've had a lot of thoughts go through my head over the years in anger that if I acted upon them, they might have resulted in some real problems. I don't act on every bad thought. And what's happening in this modern cultural revolution is this idea that people of different political persuasions claim the ability to look into your heart and say what they see there and what your ideas on and what your thoughts are, and attack you, constrain you, persecute you for what you think. This is the emergence of Orwell's Big Brother, and it is in a way that was predicted by him. It's the liberal left. It was the socialists and the communists that Orwell was worried about the most, who would become Big Brother, and that's exactly what we see. It's I keep beating up on this poor guy. It's Howard Dean, a classic Bernie Sanders socialist, who says, "Yeah, guess what? The First Amendment doesn't protect you if it's hate speech." So it is this idea of redefining historic Christianity as hate. And you know, I first thought in watching this, it was just a rhetorical device. You saw it used first by, you know, the homosexual community, and if you don't accept us, then you hate us, and so you're a hater. But the Southern Poverty Law Center has mastered this, and they have stood the whole notion on its head that we should tolerate one another's viewpoints, even those with which we disagree. Tolerance in the modern world is a one-way street. Tolerance in the modern world is you tolerate me and I persecute you, and that's what we face today. So the morphing of actions in the culture and in the courts that attack people based on their ideas is frightening. And it's no degree different than what we saw in Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. Erwin Lutzer's written about that, about the connection between the persecution that arose there and the persecution that we're going to see in the church here today. So that may not be as well put as I'd like, but I think it touches on the heartbeat of the issue. If you can turn people's legitimate ideas into something that is worthy only of the opprobrium of culture, then you've gone a long way to moving the actions of government and the actions of the court in that direction as well.
You know, you mentioned Bernie Sanders. Just in passing, we might just at least acknowledge that he was asking a whole series of questions of an individual that would be on the Office of Management and Budget, and that looked like he was trying to apply, if I could jump in with my commentary, a religious test. And again, just because this individual believed in the exclusivity of Christ, Bernie Sanders and at least one other senator really sounded like they were pretty much ready to vote against him simply on the basis of some of his Christian convictions.
And, of course, the Constitution specifically forbids any religious test for high office. And so here again, Senator Sanders is no dummy, and he knows the Constitution. He doesn't care what the Constitution says. He wants justices appointed to the Supreme Court and the federal courts that will take a liberal view of how laws should be interpreted. You might remember during the campaign, Hillary Clinton said that we should appoint Supreme Court justices that have some sensitivity towards people who are needy and downtrodden. You know, how about Supreme Court justices that have sensitivity to the meaning and application of the Constitution of the United States?
Yes.
So liberals just want to turn the courts into another means of implementing, you know, a social agenda. And, you know, that's the one positive thing that we've seen. I shouldn't say just the one, but we've seen many, many good things, even though they're struggling in the Trump administration these days. You know, the Supreme Court hangs in the balance, and seeing a justice of the caliber of Gorsuch appointed was a good thing. It may be a critical thing as we move down this road and freedom remains under attack.
Dr. Frank Wright with us. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Back in 2012, as the Mount Vernon City Council officially gavelled in their monthly meeting, someone offered a prayer. That's not terribly out of the ordinary, but something was different this time. This prayer took place at 7:28. The meeting officially started at 7:30. Everyone noticed the change. You see, the city council had received a complaint from a local atheist questioning and disparaging the practice. He even told the local press, quote, "Having a prayer of any faith creates an atmosphere of exclusion," unquote. In response, the council took the prayer off the agenda and moved it ahead 2 minutes before official business began. No one was satisfied. To the atheist, it was still exclusionary. To the rest, it was one more capitulation of driving religion from the public square. The uproar was so great that the city council was compelled to pass a resolution restoring the prayer to the agenda. Well, the whole thing was avoidable. City councils have been opening their official business with prayer since our country's beginning. The Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed this tradition, most recently explaining in Grease v. Galloway that legislative prayer is, quote, meant to lend gravity to the occasion and reflect values long part of the nation's heritage, unquote. In other words, cities opening their meetings with prayer are part of who we are as a country. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Frank Wright with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to have an open line in the second hour, so we'll certainly take some of your calls then. But if you have something specific for him, I might take that call before we wind down this particular interview. And Frank, one of the things we really like to do here at Point of View is encourage people to exercise discernment. And I think over the last 45 minutes, we've helped them develop some discernment about the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC. Next time they see that, I think any listener is going to say, well, I'm not sure I'm going to believe what they have to say. But there's another part of that I mentioned in passing, but I want to come back to it, and that is that the Southern Poverty Law Center designation was used by at least one charity aggregator called GuideStar. And there's another place where I think individuals, if they're making choices about who they support, recognize that there could be a bias there. The head of GuideStar, Jacob Harold, is an individual that chose to label 46 groups, including yours, as a hate group. And he's hardly neutral, as I've been able to investigate him a little bit. He's run as a climate change campaigner for the Rainforest Action Network, for Greenpeace USA. He's been a host for NARAL Pro-Choice. He's blogged for the Huffington Post. So sometimes when you see a particular group online that at least say that they're trying to give you honest, neutral information, all you have to do is maybe check on that group to make sure that you're not getting a heavy dose of bias with that so-called neutral information.
Kerby, I remember one of my big lessons from Little League Baseball. I played third base. There was a pop fly to the infield, and I'm under the ball, and it's way up in the sky, and it's coming down, and it's coming down. And right before I reached up for it, I heard someone say, "I've got it, I've got it." And so I stepped aside, and it fell to the ground. The person shouting, "I've got it," was on the other team, on the bench on the third base side. And the lesson is, consider the source.
Yes.
And I would render caution to anybody who uses exclusively secular entities to do the work of charity watchdog. The groups like GuideStar and Charity Navigator and many of the others literally just use the data that comes with IRS Form 990 that nonprofit organizations have to file, and they render that and they put it through their system and they calculate ratios and are you growing, are you not growing, and they use all of these secular standards. I'd encourage anybody that in addition to GuideStar, you go to ecfa.org, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. They use 7 standards of responsible stewardship in addition to all the financial data. And while we get a very poor rating on GuideStar, we get a classic rating on ECFA. And they come and audit our organization every so many years. You have to be careful where you're trying to get your information from. If you want someone that understands religious organizations, you want the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, not a secular group like GuideStar or Charity Navigator or Wall Watchers or any of those groups.
Well, again, that might be something to mention, because for an individual that was the president and CEO of the National Religious Broadcasters, you were well aware of some of those standards because a lot of those organizations were in your own backyard. So you can really speak to that with a level of credibility that most cannot. And again, I appreciate you helping us understand that we really need to have a fair amount of discernment. So just before we wind down this hour, I wanted you to, again, talk about what people might be able to do, because it does seem to me that we still need to educate our fellow Christians, first of all, about the prophets of hate. But I'm thinking even broader than that, and I know you probably are as well, because the biggest problem is a lot of our people in the mainstream media don't know about this. So I would think that if you have connections to even your local newspaper, your local radio station, your local TV station, or you know some people, maybe even the national media. Now, of course, you had Todd Starnes on the video, so obviously he knows, and people like that. But others, it's just going to be an educational process, and it seems to me that you've made it fairly easy for people to watch the video and then pass it on to someone else. And if they would just take even 10 minutes out of that 28 minutes, they'd say, whoa, I've kind of made some real mistakes by quoting them as an unassailable source. And so talk about how people can use this as a resource to begin to educate everybody in their sphere of influence.
You know, that's obviously our goal here, is to give people tools that they can use to get the truth out about this group and reveal, you know, the nature of what they're really doing. We're doing a couple of other things too, Kerby. We're actually suing, I'm going to call them our friends. We're suing our friends at Amazon.com. Because based on the Southern Poverty Law Center hate map, they refuse to allow us to participate in their Amazon Smile program. The Smile program lets people who do purchases on Amazon designate 0.5% of their purchase to anyone who's recognized under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Anyone but us, that is, or anybody else that's on the Southern Poverty Law Center hate map. So we're suing Amazon. I say we're suing. The suit will be filed the middle of next month, and we're suing them for discrimination. It's classic discrimination. They're denying us a benefit that they make available to everybody else, and solely because of what the Southern Poverty Law Center does. Now, there's some churches that are in the Amazon Smile program, but if people start digging and find out your stand on traditional marriage, your stand on human sexuality, your stand on preborn babies, you're going to find that you're a hater, and you're going to end up on these lists as well. So it's critical that we get this information out, because the tidal wave is about to break over our heads. We've got to reverse that here. How easy is it to get this, watch this video, get the link, forward it to a friend, and say, I never knew much about this. I think this is something we really ought to be looking at and be concerned about.
Well, again, Frank, we appreciate the good work that you've done over the years. I think we first crossed paths when you were at the Center for Christian Statesmanship, and I've always thought just very highly of D. James Kennedy and his ministry, Coral Ridge, as well as Truth That Transforms, and I'm just grateful that you're at D. James Kennedy Ministries. And again, that's djkm.org, or just simply follow the link that we have. And the video is entitled Prophets of Hate. And prophets are the prophets like money. And again, it is an opportunity for you to educate yourself. Take the 28 minutes to watch it, and then take the time to send it on to some other individuals. And Frank Wright, I appreciate you being involved in this project, and keep us up to date as things unfold.
Thanks, Kerby. You've been swinging the hammer a long time, too, my friend, and you've been letting the sparks fly off that anvil. It's an honor to be laboring in this portion of the Lord's vineyard with you.
Well, again, say hi to Jerry Newcomb and Scott Ray, and all the other, John Rabe, I should say, and all the other people there, which were part of that video as well. Dr. Frank Wright with us, and again, he is with D. James Kennedy Ministries. You have all the links necessary at our website, pointofview.net. Let's open up the phones. I know some of you are kind of waiting until that interview is over so that you could join our conversation. And when I come back, I want to talk about a couple of issues. Is it possible that Donald Trump will change out his attorney general? That's something people have speculated about, whether or not Jeff Sessions will be sent elsewhere and he'll replace him with the former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. The question about whether or not the Republican Congress will have accomplished anything before the August recess. I already mentioned a little bit. If we have time, we'll get into the election integrity panel and a piece by Robert Knight about how this new panel frightens those on the left. We'll get into the issue of health care and some of the articles we've posted there. But also on Friday, we spent a little bit of time talking about the working poor. I want to get into that in a little bit more detail. I've got some facts, some figures, some articles here, which just show, again, why sometimes they are the neglected group in terms of various government programs and policies. So we're going to get into all of that in the second hour. And as you hear something that you agree with or disagree with or would like clarification on or would like to share your own testimony, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break and encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll find lots of great material. And if you click on that button that says donate, we would appreciate your financial support during these summer months. We'll be right back.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I'm constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to look at a number of issues in the news, and as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, some talk about whether or not Rudy Giuliani might be the next Attorney General. That's a little bit of speculation, but it's due in large part to the fact that some people are in the Trump administration concerned that things are not moving along. Of course, there was real concern on the part of President Trump when Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, decided to recuse himself in this Russian investigation, which has dragged on for some time. But in addition to that, of course, you have one of the other very important issues that is front and center, and that is we, about a week ago, posted just a short list of all the things that the Trump administration has been able to accomplish, most of those without the help of Congress, because executive orders do not require congressional action. Various kinds of directives to the various executive branch do not require Congress other than oversight. But this particular article in The Hill, no health care overhaul, no tax reform, no infrastructure package, no budget, no government funding bill. They say in this particular article in The Hill that it is now entirely possible that congressional Republicans will depart for the long August recess without sending a single piece of major legislation to President Trump's desk. If you don't think that does have an impact on next year's midterm elections, you have to rethink some of your evaluation. So that's something we'll get into just as well. But if you'd like to address some of those issues, your comments are welcome. 1-800-351-1212. But let me get back to a topic that came up with one of our callers, I believe from Alaska, talking about the plight of the working poor. I thought it would be good to come back and address that for a few minutes, because it's something that no one ever talks about, yet every political party is concerned about. They recognize that those individuals that are in the middle income area, they represent not only where a lot of taxes are taken, but also where a lot of votes are found. And if you hear a Republican or a Democrat or even an independent talk about people that are hardworking Americans, they're oftentimes talking about individuals that are either middle class or just above the poverty line and fit into that category of the working poor. Let me take the middle class for just a minute. I love this article, came out last year. Too poor to pay for college, too rich for financial aid. It tells the story of this one individual that was just thrilled to be accepted at the University of California at San Diego. But then that joy kind of turned to reality when his parents began to deal with what is going to be required of them for their son to go to the University of California at San Diego. Because this young man, Gage, was given a grant for less than $3,000. And the school then determined how much a student can take out on federal loans, so they let him, I put that in quotes, borrow another $6,800. That still left his parents with a bill for $18,000 for the first year alone. And they go on in this article to say not only does Gage face borrowing more than $27,000 over 4 years, but his parents will need to take out $72,000 in higher interest loans. And so the conclusion of their experience was this: we are very blessed and make a decent living, but when it comes to college, we feel poor. And that's kind of the plight in many cases in the middle class. Too poor to actually have too poor to actually pay for college, but too rich to qualify for financial aid. And if you see that in a kind of a broader area of those going to college, it relates to something else, and that is there is a significant gap between those people who are poor and those people who might be in the middle class, the so-called working poor. A while back, I did a commentary, and this was based on some arguments coming from the Secretary of Public Welfare for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I, again, just give high marks to the fact that this individual did the numbers and ran the numbers and did the research, because, frankly, most states don't do that. They're afraid to do so. But the secretary there explained that a single mom is better off earning a gross income of $29,000 than earning a gross income of $69,000. Why is that? Well, if she only earns $29,000, then she receives all sorts of welfare benefits so that her total net income is $57,000. And if she were to be able to earn $69,000, her net income and benefits would be $57,000, because these benefits that they would receive are not taxable. And so the point is that when you find yourself in that kind of gap, you're not poor, you're not below the poverty line, but you're not rich, you're not even really quite in the middle class, you get hurt in ways nobody else gets hurt. And the way to illustrate this, and I may post this on our website, but I'll hold it up here for some of you to see the graph for just a minute. It's kind of intriguing because what it shows is where there's what you might call a welfare cliff. Now, by the way, there's also a Medicaid cliff and a few of these others. That is, when these bills have been written over the years, you receive benefits up until a certain amount. Let's go back to our single mom in Pennsylvania. She would be as well off earning $29,000 and getting all of these welfare benefits as she would getting $69,000. You see the problem? I mean, she could earn an additional $40,000. And first of all, how many people that are, single, especially a single mom, can make $69,000? And so you can see that in some respects, as the article that Tyler Durden talks about, when work is punished, the tragedy of America's welfare state. And so it begins to illustrate, again, one of the problems of the so-called working poor. If we can do anything in the next session of Congress, it's to eliminate some of these cliffs, some of these gaps where you have individuals who say, if I'm poor, I get a benefit because there are all sorts of welfare benefits. But if I make just $1 more, I'm on the other side and I fall off the cliff. And now I find myself in a worse position than if I just went on welfare in the first place. Now, if you believe that work has value, and as a Christian I do, I believe that we are made to do work. We are made to use our creativity. We're made to use our gifts and talents. When we have a system that in some respects actually punishes work and rewards laziness, punishes work and rewards idleness, you can begin to see the issue. So when we come back, I want to also talk a little bit more about how that works out, because when people have begun to look at this nationwide, I just gave you the story of Pennsylvania for a minute, but as individuals have looked nationwide, they've seen something else, and that is some of the research that has been done actually begins to understand again that unless you make a fairly significant wage in many of these various states, you also would be better if you did not go out and get a job. And so again, when we punish work and reward idleness, it's not so much necessarily people are always lazy, although some are. It is, in some respects, people are smart and recognize, as I used the classic illustration of a single mom who would be better just getting $29,000 than going out and getting a job and making $69,000. We have a lot more to say about that, but if you'd like to join our conversation, perhaps you have illustrations of your own, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, David Brooks took on the difficult task of reminding us that class distinctions in America do make a difference. For that, he was pilloried in the social media. He was trying to explain how the privileged elite are ruining America. He unfortunately came off to some as an example of another privileged elite. He may have fared better if he had not mentioned taking a friend with only a high school degree to a sandwich shop that had sandwiches with nearly unpronounceable Italian names. If we ignore that paragraph, he really had some important observations. For example, he showed how upper middle-class moms and parents confer on their children certain benefits often unavailable to others. Put simply, they spend more time with their kids. He also focused on how the privileged also are able to exclude other people's children from their same opportunities. Richard Reeves writes about this in his book, Dream Hoarders. Zoning restrictions are one way. Well-educated people tend to live in places like Portland, New York, and San Francisco. I talked about this in a recent commentary about bubbles. Many of the people in blue states and liberal cities are socially isolated from the rest of society. Many of these zoning restrictions also serve to keep the poor and the less educated away from places with good schools and good job opportunities. Another structural barrier is college admissions. Educated parents live in neighborhoods with the best schools and the best teachers. This gives an obvious advantage to students who want to go to college of their choice. David Brooks does not mention other advantages that occur to me. Students with affluent parents may not need to get a summer job so they can do internships or volunteer work that looks good on resumes. They can also afford to take test prep courses in order to do well on SAT tests. David Brooks identifies a real concern, but unfortunately too many decided to lampoon his attempt to explain why it is a problem. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Wanted for just a few more minutes to talk about this idea of the working poor and also the issue of welfare and the middle-class squeeze and all sorts of other issues. And if you felt that, I'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Talked for just a minute about this piece from Tyler Durden, which he ran all the numbers here, and I won't go into all the details, but if you start looking at such things as what's available to aid to potential children and child care and energy and housing and cash and those kinds of things, you recognize that sometimes it makes as much sense to not work as it means to work. And a good illustration of this came from the Cato Institute a number of years ago, and I've written about this, and you can find this on our website as well. I have one called Work or Welfare and another Welfare and Work. So they look at two different aspects of that, but let me pick out one of those. And that is the study found that welfare actually pays more than minimum wage in 35 states. So in other words, if you go out and work at a minimum wage job, you would be, at least in these 35 states, better off if you actually went on welfare. It turns out that in 13 of those states, welfare pays better than $15 an hour. So you're now beginning to talk about some of those states that have really high minimum wage, higher than what's the federal minimum wage. And the reason for this is simple. The federal government funds about 126 different separate programs which are aimed at low-income citizens. Now, if there's anything that the Trump administration could do over the next 4 years, it would be to begin to consolidate some of those and eliminate waste and duplication. But nevertheless, let's set that aside for just a minute. and recognize that of those 126, 72 of them provide either cash or in-kind benefits in one way or another. And while it's true that no family or individual gets benefit from all those 72 programs, you can begin to see the problem. Now, Michael Tanner of the Cato Institute, and he's a little bit blunt here, but okay, here's how he's trying to get your attention. And, of course, when you publish a scientific study, you sometimes want to get the attention of people that write editorial pages and write news articles. So this is intended to be a little more blunt than it intends, so don't be offended by it. But he said, here's an offer for you, $38,000 per year tax-free, no work required. Apply at your local welfare office. And the argument he's making is that we now have, in so many different states, more welfare benefits than a minimum wage job provides. And in 13 states, we have more welfare benefits than you would get if you worked at $15 an hour. Can you see what the problem is? This is why there are so many people that call themselves the working poor. I want to work, but I'm not so sure I wouldn't be better off if I just didn't work and tried to apply for welfare. Michael Tanner puts it this way. He says there's no evidence that people on welfare are lazy, but he adds they're not stupid. If you pay more for welfare than work, it is easy to guess what they will do. Why work when welfare pays so much? And so there are these stories that have begun to come out. Let me use one example. This one came out a number of years ago in the New York Post, and I think it illustrates only so well the problem. Now, I recognize that some of you don't live in the New England states. You don't live in New York. You don't live in Connecticut. But let me just use New York as an example. And that is, in New York, a family receiving temporary assistance for needy families, things like Medicaid, food stamps, WIC, public housing, utility assistance, and free commodities, things like milk and cheese, would have a package benefits of what? $38,000, which we just talked about a minute ago. And then they go on and say, while that may not sound overly generous, remember that these welfare benefits are not taxed. Imagine if you were making $38,000, and I know a number of people, including my daughter, was making $40,000 a year, but you're getting taxed on it. You're paying FICA, Social Security, all sorts of things on that. So again, it shows that if you just took New York State as an example, you would have to, in the state of New York, have to earn $21 per hour in order for you to be better off than if you're on welfare. And this one is just looking at an apples-to-apples comparison. But if you go back to the example I just gave you a few minutes ago from Pennsylvania and begin to recognize what is and isn't taxed, you can begin to see that we have some really major issues to talk about. And so this is one of the reasons, as we were talking about on Friday briefly, that people that are in the middle class, especially the so-called working poor, maybe those that we fit into what we call the lower middle class, feel completely squeezed out because in some respects, if you're wealthy, there are all sorts of benefits that you have. And if you're poor, there are all sorts of benefits. But if you're in the middle, nothing at all. It's a little bit back to the illustration I gave just a few minutes ago about going to college. If you're wealthy enough, you can afford to send your kid to college. And I went to graduate school and knew other kids whose parents were quite wealthy. I mean, when you go to places like Yale and Georgetown, you meet kids that come from very affluent backgrounds. And so their parents could fund everything and probably not even blink an eye at it. But then you also would meet some students who, because of their academic prowess and because their parents were very poor, were on a full-ride scholarship. But it's those of us kind of in between that found ourselves not rich enough to actually pay for it, but not poor enough to qualify for financial aid. And you kind of get squeezed in the middle. And if you can see that in terms of college admissions and paying for college, you can begin to see how this is played out in situations in which we have individuals who say maybe it's better to go on welfare than to go on work. One last piece before we take a break, and then I'll open up for some comments you might have or move on to some other issues. Neil Gabler, writing in The Atlantic the other day, began his essay with this very disturbing statistic. He said he was talking about a survey that was done by the Federal Reserve Board, And the survey asked respondents how they would pay for a $400 emergency. And they found that 47% of the respondents said they would cover the expense either by borrowing or selling something. In other words, it's a way of saying that almost half of the individuals that they interviewed, so about half of all Americans, could not come up with $400 any other way. So Neil Gabler, writing in the Atlantic, said, "Who knew?" And then he answers, "Well, I knew because I'm one of that 47%. And he goes on to say that what it was like to kind of swallow his pride and have to sometimes dun people to pay him so that he could pay others, because he's a writer, basically, and so he would need to get his various royalty checks early so he could pay off somebody else, pay just for the heat bill or the lighting bill or whatever. He says it's what it's like to dread going to the mailbox because there were new bills, but rarely a check to pay for them. And he most importantly said he knew the shame of what he had to do to tell his daughter that he might not be able to pay for her wedding. And so the point he was making is that what we're seeing right now in the middle class are a very significant number of individuals, if asked to come up with $400 for an emergency. And we all have had those, haven't we? You know, you have a tire blowout and you need another tire. You have a car accident. Your water heater goes out, whatever it might be, and you know that you're going to have to come up with $400. And the bottom line is you can't actually come up with $400. And he goes on to point out that we don't really know how many people are struggling because, as he said, one financial psychologist said that you're more likely to hear from your buddy that he's on Viagra than he has credit card problems. In other words, to struggle financially is a source of shame, and oftentimes the only protection is silence. So again, another study concluded that nearly half of all Americans are what are called financially fragile. They're living close to the financial edge. And I think it's worth mentioning that it's not just a liquidity problem. It's that they don't have enough ready cash in their checking account and savings account. But it also points out that the median net worth has dropped significantly. So again, this was a question that was raised on our Friday weekend edition. But I thought I'd give you just a little bit of thought about this whole idea of the working poor, how the middle class is being squeezed, and how, in many cases, coming up with $400 is really difficult for a lot of Americans. If you agree or disagree, I'd love to get your comments. Last half hour, an open line. We'll get into a couple of other issues, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about this as well. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join the conversation today, does this sound like your life or maybe the life of people that you know? Are there needs for us to begin to rethink how we structure some of these governmental policies, and how are you coping with some of the financial demands on you? Love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take those calls right after this.
Rebecca Hagelin has been influencing public policy as an author, columnist, and executive at places like the Heritage Foundation for more than 30 years, and Point of View Radio stoked her fire.
I used to turn it on every day, and when my husband would come home from work, I would say, "This is what they said on Point of View today, and this is what they said." I just wanted to be connected into the places where I could make a difference.
Rebecca has made a big difference with her life, and let's just say she's a big fan.
There's no better resource, there's no better truth sayer, there's no better place to go for information for people who are worthy of their money than Point of View.
Point of View makes a difference by inspiring and informing people who make a difference. And you can make a difference today when you invest in the Truth Team. Join us today. Find out how by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team, 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And if you do have a chance to get through on the program today, since we do have a full bank of phone calls, I have also left an open line for tomorrow. So we will continue that conversation tomorrow and certainly look forward to that opportunity. But let's take some phone calls. Perhaps you have some comments about the welfare state or about the squeeze on the middle class, or the plight of the working poor, or a variety of other issues. That's all fair game, and let's take so many phone calls before we end our program today. We'll go to KBJS in Texas. Michael, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hey, Kerby, thank you. I was curious about what your take is on implementing a flat tax. Part of the reason I ask is because I got a new job several months ago, and although the increased pay is great, it's helping me get out of debt, I've noticed that I've got an 18 to 20% tax on my income, whereas it was significantly less when I was working just barely over minimum wage. And that, although the increased pay helped. Yeah, anyway, I'm sure you know where I'm going with that. How would that actually help people get out of welfare and generally improve the market?
A couple of things. First of all, predictability. I don't know about you, but for me, even though I'm a pretty smart individual, I have no idea until we do our taxes in March or April whether I owe taxes or whether I'm going to get something back. Now, that's only because I don't know which deductions, how many there are. You know, theoretically, I could kind of get a general estimate. But first of all, you don't have that kind of predictability. If you know you make this much and you know the tax is this much, and there aren't all these things, all these loopholes, all these deductions, all of that, that I think would make it more predictable. Number two, it would be a flatter tax, so you wouldn't have the situation, Michael, that you're having now. I talked about the welfare cliff. You've run into a different one, and that is you've moved into a different tax bracket. And so as you get more income, you then are in the next tax bracket, and you're taxed higher rates. And so that is certainly another issue. And if you just simply eliminated all of the tax preparation details, there'd still be room for tax accountants. There would still be the need for some kind of IRS to collect taxes. But all of the detail, the convoluted information, the long tax codes, which I think are just a complete waste of time, might begin to develop in a way that would have entrepreneurial development of various kinds of jobs and businesses and things of that nature. So I would argue that a flat tax or a fair tax would be better than what we have right now. We can have a debate, and I'll be glad to do another one of those, the difference between a flat tax and a fair tax and which is better or which is more preferable. But any of that would be better than what we have right now, because if you look at the tax code, it just goes on for volumes. And the fact that even really smart people that do tax accounting every day sometimes can't necessarily come to the same conclusions about what some of these businesses owe in terms of taxes, it shows that it's time to come up with something different. So this was one of the things we're hoping that Congress would deal with, some form of tax reform. I didn't expect a flat tax, but even a flatter tax right now would be better for you, and I think better for America. So thanks for asking. Let me go to Roxanne in North Carolina at the moment. And Roxanne, you're on the air. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, I just wanted to, as a 32-year-old young educated woman, I wanted to just give it out there that I do not think it's the parents' responsibility to send their kids to college and to give them the fancy princess wedding. I think it is their responsibility, because I think, if anything, you learn more of the value of a dollar and you learn the art of patience. And in this society of instantaneous results and the Facebook phenomena, we have forgotten that. And we are teaching our children that everything happens instantaneous. And if you want it, you can get it just at the click of a button. And don't get me wrong, I love me some Amazon Prime, but I also believe in not having credit card debt. And if you can't afford to pay cash, you can't afford it.
Oh, boy, you've got the right attitude there. We need to have you
Oh,
call in
let
again
me
on
tell you.
Wednesdays on our Millennial Roundtable, because that instant gratification is a real problem. And for those of us that went to graduate school, and I finally paid off my student loans. The next month we were paying for braces for our kids. So, I understand that only so well when you say, you've got to work your way through and you've got to pay your freight and you've got to understand that money does not grow on that tree in the backyard and all those kinds of things. Those are lessons we need to pass on to this generation. So I would completely agree with you.
Absolutely. And I'll be honest, as someone that is an educated person, both my husband and I, we have put off having children. And like I said, I'm 32, so I know I can't wait too long, but because we want to make sure that we're financially capable. I don't think it's anyone's responsibility but mine to take care of that. And I sure as heck am not going to depend on my parents and they didn't give me a car when I turned 16. I had a full ride to go to college because like you said, you gotta put in the grades to do it, and you gotta do what you gotta do. And if that meant me having 3 jobs as a college senior, guess what? I did it. And I just think we have really forgotten that. And we are now, when you gave the statistic, it just really hit me that I have friends that have massive amounts of debt, and I'm like, what are you doing? I question their decision making, because it's like, you don't have $400 to cover a bill. What if a tree falls on your house and you've got to pay the $5,000 house insurance deductible? What are you going to do? You are a grown adult. There was a bank out there that said you could have a loan, but you can't afford the deductible because something happened to your house. And that just really makes me question this, some of the things that we're doing as a culture, but also this instantaneousness. And I just wish people had a better grasp of financial responsibility. And so that's the reason I was calling in. So it was so nice to listen to your show. I'm riding down the road, and so it's been a really great show.
Well, I appreciate you calling, and thank you for being, first of all, such a good role model. And parents, I hope you were listening to Roxanne, because she's got some great advice. And you young people that's probably are maybe listening to this program today because you're out of school, just recognize that you can learn some really good financial lessons, and it comes from work, comes from saving, comes from investing, and most importantly, giving your tithe to the local church and to Christian organizations. But let's go back to the phones, because we have a lot more to talk about with so many different individuals. So we'll head to South Carolina this time. And Peter, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Hi, good morning, or good afternoon, rather. I just wanted to add, I come from a kind of a different background. Neither of my parents or my wife's parents were college educated, but they both placed a lot of importance on education. We both enjoyed a good education, and we're successful business people. And I left business about 15 years ago and became an urban inner city school teacher. And I see the kids that I see, even the kids that are really smart and really working hard, so they fall into a trap because they have no point of reference as to what is a good decision and a bad decision. And they grow up in Section 8 housing and on welfare. And I've had kids that are some of the smartest kids in my classes say, well, why would I want to buy a house? Why wouldn't I just, let somebody else pay for it, and then if it gets wrecked, they can move somewhere else.
That's right.
And so we have a whole generation of kids that are learning not to take personal responsibility, and it's really become endemic. And I think it happens more in the inner city because that tends to be where the poverty exists. And although I imagine in very rural areas it may be the same situation, but my experience has been inner city. Inner
city for sure. And that's what we call the culture of poverty. And I might just mention before you go on that, the scriptures talk about that. There's a proverb that says the ruin of the poor is their poverty. And the idea is that once you're poor, sometimes you develop bad habits that keep you in poverty. And one of those is dependency that you just talked about. But continue, because I want people to understand that in some cases this becomes sort of a psychological, it's not so much an economic issue, it's a psychological issue, isn't it?
No, it's definitely a psychological issue. In fact, I would say it's more so than economic, because I've had students that had good grades and were smart enough to be able to go to college, but they didn't have any role models to suggest that. I mean, if they didn't get a total free ride, and I mean total,
yes,
because I've had kids who've gotten $20,000 in scholarships at the end of their senior year, but they want to go to a school that costs $23,000, and so it's out of reach. And it's really a shame, because if that had been in my family, I got $20,000, I needed $23,000. The only alternative would go out and bust your tail until you made $3,000.
Gotcha.
You had to do it. And,
that's how we did it.
They're looking at it like, well, I didn't get enough. I guess I won't go.
Just amazing.
So it's just a real psychological issue.
Yes, it certainly is.
A mindset.
Peter, I'm coming to a break, and I hope you'll call back again, because I, first of all, appreciate the fact that you were dedicated to do that, and I thank you for sharing that. And again, it just helps us understand what I call the culture of poverty. And the Proverbs talk about that. The ruin of the poor is their poverty. Once you get into this mindset, sometimes it's difficult to get out. That's why I think the church has so much to do to address this issue of poverty, to change worldviews and mindsets. Let's take a break. We'll take some more phone calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Back in 2012, as the Mount Vernon City Council officially gavelled in their monthly meeting, someone offered a prayer. That's not terribly out of the ordinary, but something was different this time. This prayer took place at 7:28. The meeting officially started at 7:30. Everyone noticed the change. You see, the city council had received a complaint from a local atheist questioning and disparaging the practice. He even told the local press, quote, "Having a prayer of any faith creates an atmosphere of exclusion," unquote. In response, the council took the prayer off the agenda and moved it ahead 2 minutes before official business began. No one was satisfied. To the atheist, it was still exclusionary. To the rest, it was one more capitulation of driving religion from the public square. The uproar was so great that the city council was compelled to pass a resolution restoring the prayer to the agenda. Well, the whole thing was avoidable. City councils have been opening their official business with prayer since our country's beginning. The Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed this tradition, most recently explaining in Greece v. Galloway that legislative prayer is, quote, meant to lend gravity to the occasion and reflect values long part of the nation's heritage, unquote. In other words, cities opening their meetings with prayer are part of who we are as a country. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go out to California. I think it's Araceli. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi.
Hey, what would you like to add?
Well, basically, I would like to add, well, I'm a working mother. I have 2 kids, and I feel I always have to constantly work. And my kids are always home, and I have no time with them.
Yes.
And I'm also wanting to go to school, but just to know that there's no way of working around that, I was just wondering, like, what is the best advice for that?
Yeah, what you're really talking about is kind of time management and emotional management and physical management. I don't think I've ever said this before, but people sometimes ask, apart from the Bible, what's the most significant book that's ever affected your life? And without a beat, I always say, well, probably the book Margin by Richard Swenson. Now, he's been on the program with us, but it's been years. And the idea behind Margin is this. We need to make sure that we're not always on overload. You know, if you actually drive a car and it has the RPMs, you never want the RPMs to be in the red line. I get the sense right now as a working parent, wanting to go to school and everything, you're probably in the red zone lots of times. And the idea of margin is to begin to at least move in a direction where you have some margin. By that you mean that your load and your limits are different, that your limit and your load aren't right next to each other. In some cases, people's load is over their limit. You need to back off a little bit. And so to think about, you know, having emotional margin, financial margin, even spiritual margin are really important. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that it's easier to say than to do, but I found that that book really helped me begin to think about ordering my priorities, figuring out what I need to make as the essentials. Certainly spending time with your kids is an essential, and really trying to kind of sort through what makes sense. So that book by Dr. Richard Swenson called Margin, when it first came out, hoped that it would be a bestseller. It was. He was on with Dr. Dobson. I think you can find that book still in most bookstores. Richard Swenson's book, The Margin. Another book that came to mind is Bruce Miller's book, Rhythm, because there's rhythms to life, too. As a mother or as a woman, you recognize, you know, sometimes women say, well, I can do it all. Not really. There's maybe a time to raise your kids. There's a time to work. There's a time to, and sometimes the idea of rhythms, especially some of the biblical rhythms, are very important. Things like a Sabbath and all sorts of others. So those are some books that I found very helpful. But again, I think all of it has to be done with some level of prayer. And if you also have somebody that's spiritually discerning, that can be maybe a mentor or a person to keep you accountable or to ask you some questions, I think that would be helpful as well. Obviously, since I don't know your unique circumstances, I can't really talk to that, but I just want to at least maybe mention some books, not only for you, but for others, to just think about making sure you have some margin in your life so that you're not always on overload and eventually just one of those individuals that crash and burn on the side of the road. But let's go back to the phones, give a few more of you a chance to join the conversation today. We'll go to the state of Illinois this time. Nick, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that Jesus said that the poor you have with you always, and the church should and continue to deal directly with the poor, in my view. The lady that called in she's preaching to the choir. She's wonderful, but she couldn't get elected to anything.
Yes.
And not even dog catcher. She couldn't get elected to anything. So we need, when people crawl up the ladder of success, they need to do it the traditional way, the American way, by hard work and frugality and just patience. But right now, President Trump is trying to cut back. It's in today's paper. He's trying to cut back on programs, and the Republicans are not carrying through cutting back these unnecessary programs, and there's no end to the socialism, to the welfare state, if it goes that far. You know what I'm saying? That's my opinion.
Well, it's a good one, and it's one of the topics I was going to put on the table tomorrow. I've done a little bit of work on some of the regulations that the Trump administration has been able to end, in part because they have the authority. Then I was going to talk about how the liberal left and even some of the establishment Republicans have found some ways to fight against it, and one of those has been in the court. So we'll spend some time tomorrow in the second hour talking about regulations, how we might be able to cut certain regulations, certain programs. Of course, you've already heard me mention the number of welfare programs. I don't think we need 126 different welfare programs. We can begin to consolidate some of those. And so if you have a Secretary of Health and Human Services, if you have the Secretary of HUD, and I would have to say that the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, and the Secretary of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, have the desire to begin to do some of that. Some of that they can do because they're heading up those organizations. Some of that requires congressional action. And so we're back to another issue we'll talk about tomorrow, and that is it really possible that the Republican Congress, recognize you have Republicans in control of the House, Republicans in control of the Senate, you have a Republican in the Oval Office. Is it really possible that after all these months, we have no health care overhaul, we have no tax reform, we have no infrastructure package, we have no budget, and we have no government funding bill, and they're going to go on a recess in August? I mean, I hope that this is not going to happen, and if they do, I think we better go look for some other candidates, because if you sat in your job for 6 months and produced nothing and then decided to go on a 1-month vacation, I think they'd just say, you don't need to come back. And that may be what we need to tell some of these individuals. Just about out of time, so let me, if I can, postpone some of these calls till tomorrow. I apologize if you didn't get through. I did get a couple of phone calls here, and we certainly do recommend that you give us a call tomorrow. One of the articles I've posted today, which I didn't really quote from too much, is called Bipartisan Dishonesty. This is one by Jonah Goldberg. I appreciate it because he's sort of an equal opportunity grief giver, because on the one point he talks about some of the things I just mentioned about the Republicans campaigning to appeal Obamacare, and they were doing all these things and nothing happened. But then he goes on and says, before liberal readers pull a muscle nodding their heads, the Democrats aren't any better. Obamacare itself was lied to in passage. You can keep your plan, you can keep your doctor, your premiums won't go up, and all the rest. And so there is a sense in which he points out that if you want to lay some blame on Congress, there's enough to go around to both parties. And so I wanted you to read that particular article. We have the information in the first interview hour that we did with Frank Wright on the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they got another one called A Life Unworthy, where it kind of takes this very well-watched film last week, Dunkirk, and ties it into Brexit and Charlie Gard and some of the other issues we've talked about. So we've got a couple of really good articles we've posted on the website, so I would encourage you to go to the website, find those articles, and pass them on to your friends. And in particular, as I mentioned in the first hour, if you hadn't had a chance to listen to the program, we had Dr. Frank Wright with us. And they have this video, which is entitled Prophets of Hate, the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it's about 28 minutes long. So I would really encourage you to watch it. It's a little bit longer than many of the videos we post, but it's certainly worth watching. And then click that share button and send it to someone that needs to know about that. In some respects, it might be somebody that you work with. It might be somebody you're having a conversation with. It might be a local reporter who has no idea about some of this. So again, that's why we wanted to make that available to you today on the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, hope you'll also click on that donate button. It is the summer months. That's the time when we most desperately need your financial support, because sometimes people are on vacation. So if you can help us out, we would appreciate that as well. I want to thank Andrew and Elisa for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. See you back here tomorrow.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.